Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. This is Ed Dodson speaking to you. If you're a subscriber, hopefully you've found benefit in the various lectures and course material that I provided. I've been teaching history and political economy for almost 5 decades now, and what I think is important insights into how the world works, I've tried to provide to my students and to those of you who find me online. My message today will be fairly brief, but as we start a new year, I've become increasingly concerned about the retrogression that we are experiencing in the struggle for individual liberty and equality of opportunity around the world. And no doubt there is just a very basic reason for this that's not fully understood. First, we have to understand that much of the wealth accumulated by individuals is unearned, derived from what economists describe as, quote, rent-seeking privileges under our systems of law. The methods by which public revenue is raised in most countries is the main source of such privileges. Take so-called capital gains, for example. Actual capital goods, buildings, machinery, technologies, they depreciate in value and in their usefulness, their functional utility over time. What increases in value over time is the value of natural assets, such as locations in our towns and cities, land that's blessed by natural resources, frequencies on the broadcast spectrum, and even takeoff and landing slots at airports. What these natural assets have in common is a zero cost of production in terms of labor and capital goods, and equally important, they have an inelastic supply. We cannot produce more natural assets. All we can do is apply our labor and capital goods to produce new forms of assets that are then subject to depreciation or almost immediate consumption. Thus, a public revenue system that rewards production rather than hoarding or speculation of these natural assets would impose a zero rate of taxation on the goods we produce and an annual charge on the exclusive control of natural assets equal to the potential annual rental value of those assets. The economists refer to this value as economic rent. What I describe here is not a new proposal. It was put forward in the mid-18th century by the French political economists known as physiocrats. Adam Smith embraced their analysis in his chapters of The Wealth of Nations dealing with economic rent. Another Scot, Patrick Edward Dove, picked up the idea in the 19th century, and he was followed by the American Henry George in the 1870s, igniting a global movement in support of eliminating all taxation except for that on the rental value of land, which George argued is not really taxation anyway. It is a charge for benefits received. A long list of other thoughtful analysts and economists have continued to argue the merits of this systemic reform. Leo Tolstoy tried to convince the Russian Tsar of its merits to quiet the rumblings for revolution in Russia. Sun Yat-sen brought the scheme to China during its nationalist period, and a watered-down approach was eventually introduced by Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. Among the many economists of the 20th century in the United States whose writings embraced Henry George's analysis included were Scott Nearing, John R. Commons, and very prominently Harry Gunnison Brown. They were joined later by Mason Gaffney, who ended up teaching for many years at the University of California. Some economists in the United States supported a gradual implementation of the idea at the local level, restructuring property taxes into a two-rate tax that gradually increased the rate of taxation on assessed land values while reducing the rate on assessed building values. Among this group were C. Lowell Harris at Columbia University, Dick Netzer at NYU, and Nick Tiedemann at Virginia Tech. Each of these economists and others have written extensively on the approach. Various degrees of support can be found in the writings of Michael Hudson and former World Bank economist Joseph Stiglitz. To the above list could be added professors of economics and political economy teaching at universities in almost every other country one might name, going back to the early 20th century. Beginning in the late 1990s, I initiated a project to collect their writings and bring them to public attention. The principles their perspectives embraced were described in a talk given at the 1988 Council of Georgist Organizations Conference by history professor Paul Gaston. He called those principles cooperative individualism. This immediately struck me as a term that best described what Adam Smith, the physiocrats, Henry George, and the others I've mentioned were after. And so thus began my effort to establish the School of Cooperative Individualism as an internet repository of any and all material related to these principles. This has turned out to be a project rich in its discoveries and that continues to expand even as I am recording this today. It's time for implementation of the systemic changes necessary for the realization of cooperative individualism. In fact, this is long overdue if we want to solve the most serious of our economic and social problems. The time is long overdue to end what many writers, including most recently a British colleague of mine, Fred Harrison, condemns as centuries of dominance by free riders and cheaters. Fred Harrison's writings in more than a dozen books cover these issues in great depth, and I highly recommend them to you. He argues that there is a redistribution of income and wealth from its producers to those who, by legal privilege, are able to take without offering any goods or service in exchange. The net result of this is generational poverty under systems that make it almost impossible for many individuals to rise above their station at birth. And quite often, even those who have some level of economic independence during their lives lose it because of the nature of our economies to go through cycles of boom and bust. So there's much to be done, and I continue to do what I can. I invite you to join me in this campaign. Call it a crusade if you like. It is a mission that I believe is extremely important, and we need many, many more people to join in this campaign to convince our elected representatives and our other leading citizens that this is the approach that needs to be followed if we're ever going to solve the problems that we have, and if we're going to preserve what level of democracy we still have and expand that level of democracy for our republics going forward. Thank you very much.